Hi, so I am Professor Frank Rudy Cooper, and I am a William S. Boyd Professor of Law and also Director of the Program on Race, Gender, and Policing at the William S. Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I have been a law professor for 21 years. I started at Villanova University School of Law as a visiting assistant professor back in 2000. And then I continued on at Villanova for a few years. Then I went to Suffolk University Law School in Boston, which is actually where I'm from. I grew up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was returning home to be with my wife, now wife. and then about, I guess now, a little over 5 years ago, I got recruited by UNLV and we came out here to Las Vegas and we love it. It's great. I should mention that I clerked for Solomon Oliver Jr. of the Federal District Court for the Northern District of Ohio in Cleveland. And I actually lived in Cleveland Heights when I was clerking for the judge.
It's amazing how many Cleveland Heights connections there are in this series. So thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about your article from 2020 called Count Fragility and Blue Lives Matter. And I would love for you to begin by kind of walking us through how you came to write this article and maybe what you discovered in doing so.
Oh, well, that's a really helpful question. So I've long been interested, I guess I should just say a little bit about my trajectory as a scholar. So I started off writing about racial profiling, particularly from the vantage point or methodological point of view of cultural studies. So I wrote a few articles about racial profiling and the drug war. Then I got very interested I had since undergrad at Amherst College and then law school at Duke Law School, been very interested in critical race feminism. And I got interested in the question of, well, how does critical race feminism apply to men and particularly to men of color and Black men? And so I wrote a couple articles about masculinity studies, feminist masculinity studies as applied to usually to Black men and to policing. And from there, I've done a number of articles that sort of look at the intersections of race and gender and policing. When I came to this point, I was still just thinking sort of conceptually about how policing works and thinking particularly about the advent of the Black Lives Matter movement, which came about in around 2014, depending on how you count, after the Trayvon Martin case and the Michael Brown case out of Ferguson. And I was kind of curious about what I saw as a reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is what now gets called the Blue Lives Matter movement. And that, I think, led me to this topic. I did a bunch of reading on sort of how police think of themselves. And in looking at that, I saw something that I'd seen a little bit earlier in some of my research. So I was the person in law, at least, who coined the term depolicing. And when I talked about depolicing, I was interested in the idea that there's racial profiling, and racial profiling is usually used as a critique of the police for focusing on usually young men of color. But depolicing was when the police then started to pull back from policing the racial minority neighborhoods as a response to the criticism. And I thought I might be seeing something similar here, where you have the racial profiling critique and then develops this sort of responsive depolicing. Here, what I see in some ways is the Black Lives Matter critique of, really it's a critique of our culture of surveying Black and brown people in this country, because it definitely has to do with individual sort of vigilantism, like George Zimmerman. But I thought that I saw a responsive move in the Blue Lives Matter movement to the Black Lives Matter critique. And so that's why I got interested in that reaction and what it might tell us.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting how you kind of insert the frame of Robin DiAngelo's white fragility and apply it to police, because it kind of picks up their narrative and then kind of reframes their reframing of the narrative, which is fantastic. But I think, so if you could kind of walk us through, I mean, I think people are familiar with white fragility, but maybe you could kind of walk us through how white fragility and what you kind of term as, what you could term as cop fragility, and how those two kind of play off of each other and inform each other.
Sure. So the DiAngelo thesis is, in essence, that in her experience as a social work professor and as a diversity trainer, that some white folks were very resistant to the idea that there had been a history of racism in this country and that they had been privileged by it. And by privileged by it, she just meant that there were some sort of advantages that they might have gained from being white in this country that they maybe hadn't sought, but would receive anyways unless they affirmatively tried to disgorge those advantages. So she termed the resistance to that understanding of race and its history in this country white fragility. When I looked at police and particularly the Blue Lives Matter movement, I saw, again, a resistance to the critique that the Black Lives Matter movement was putting forward. And to be fair, the Black Lives Matter movement is heterogeneous, but it generally is a very thoroughgoing critique of policing. It basically sees policing, and not necessarily all, but sort of a pattern in individual police officers as motivated by racial social control. And by that, we're talking about the marginalization of disfavored social groups, particularly Black and Brown, particularly young men. And so that critique is a very serious critique that you might expect to bring forth resistance, and it surely has brought forth resistance. The response in some ways has been, not only is Black Lives Matter wrong, that the specific response to that usually being all lives matter, and I'll talk about that in a second. But not only is Black Lives Matter wrong about police, but in fact, we should be all the more supportive of police because they have a tough job. So Blue Lives Matter sort of says we haven't paid enough attention to the concerns of police officers, and we ought to be bending over backwards to support police officers against this critique of Black Lives Matter. Backing up for a second to the idea of the All Lives Matter movement. So All Lives Matter in some ways maybe misunderstands the Black Lives Matter critique, because the Black Lives Matter critique is that police have not cared about Black lives, and in particular about Black lives. Not the police are always over aggressive or use force, but that they only use force against Black people, but that they have a much greater tendency to use force against Black people. So the critique is, hey, you're not valuing Black lives. The response, all lives matter, doesn't make a lot of sense in that context, because of course, the idea of Black Lives Matter is that all lives matter, including Black lives, right? And as the comedian Michael Che from Saturday Night Live has said, all Black Lives Matter says in essence is Black lives matter. That's it, just matter. And he makes a great series of jokes about the fact that that shouldn't be so controversial. But we know it has been. And just to get back to the thread of your question, we go from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter to Blue Lives Matter. And Blue Lives Matter is the strong resistance to the Black Lives Matter critique, which is how I link it back to white fragility. Here it's sort of blue fragility, or as I've termed it, cop fragility.
Yeah, and I think that's an important progression to make because you can only understand like the Blue Lives Matter as a callback to Black Lives Matter, but also in like folding in this other critique. But so maybe you could talk some about what Blue Lives Matter is and how you see it functions in dialogue with Black Lives Matter, because I think it is very much a give and take or a reaction to.
Yeah, so in the article, I talk about a couple of aspects of the Blue Lives Matter response. One of the first things I do is to point out that when we say Blue Lives Matter and we use the idea of the thin blue line, the thin blue line is the idea that the police are a thin blue line between order and chaos. And given that the police focus so much of their resources on patrolling poor Black and brown neighborhoods, it seems pretty clear that they think they're the thin blue line between poor Black and brown neighborhoods and the rest of us, right? With the rest of us being implicitly sort of suburban and white communities. So I argue that there's already implicit in that a sort of racial narrative of splitting whites from Blacks and browns. And therefore, it's not surprising, perhaps, that there's been disproportionate excessive force against Black and brown communities because they're seen as a separate and dangerous, chaotic element in this narrative of the thin blue line. So that was the first thing that I thought was important to note about the thin blue line. I think on top of that, when we talk about Blue Lives Matter, we can think about the legal movement there. And there's a legal movement, it's mostly done, but it has sought to especially criminalize any force used against police officers. Now, I think, of course, we all agree that if somebody, jumps a cop, kills a cop, that ought to be a very serious crime. At least as serious as any such crime against anybody else. And maybe in the context of hate crimes legislation, it ought to be, I guess I have to back up for a second and say, I don't think it's a hate crime because I don't think that the police what hate crimes are for is usually for who have been lynched in this country, for Jewish people who have been subject to anti-Semitism, including a lot of physical violence historically in this country, and other groups, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender folks who have been subject to a great deal of discrimination historically. And so in that, what hate crimes are supposed to do is say, when you do something that taps into this history of especially virulent violence against these communities, we think that it's even worse. And we want to express the community's values of equality by showing that we are no longer in the past of this virulent discrimination. So I don't think that the police are historically discriminated against group. And so I don't think that hate crimes should be applied to somebody just because they did it because they're a police officer. Having said that, the argument that there ought to be hate crime legislation applied to attacks on police officers has its greatest force when you think of a few high-profile incidents of police getting jumped and shot and killed, which is awful. I certainly don't condone violence against the police or anybody. But where it really seems like it's going to land is in resisting arrest, right? So that even just the police come to arrest you and you shove them back, you think you shouldn't be arrested and you resist arrest in that simple way, that could become a hate crime with a significant aggravating circumstance and sentence enhancement. And I don't think that's right. But that's the sort of legal part of the movement, is to make any sort of resistance to police a hate crime. And it connects to the idea that blue lives matter, that blue lives matter maybe more than other lives, and that we ought to sort of hyper protect police.
Yeah, and that's thank you for clarifying and as you said, most of those laws either did not pass or were, when they did pass, were more symbolic or were really watered down. I think that in the article it said 22 states considered them, 13 passed some police protection, but not necessarily hate crime legislation, right?
Right, and but the heart of it is that a lot of states now have special protection for police that doesn't deal with like shooting a police officer, but just with any type of resistance to arrest. And that especially concerns me.
Yeah, that is very concerning, given some of the examples I've heard from other scholars as well. So I want to get back to, right, now that we kind of have framed what Blue Lives Matter is and how it's kind of a reaction. It is a reaction to Black Lives Matter. It's not in conversation, though, is it? It's more of a Black Lives Matter saying, this is our critique, and Blue Lives Matter is saying something completely different. So how are they responding?
Well, I guess they're responding by saying, we resist the idea that there needs to be special concern about police treatment of Black and brown and other racial minority peoples. And then they're sort of responding by saying, like, even despite the critique, there ought to be heightened protection of police officers, that policing is a tough job, which it is a tough job. And my belief is policing is a really tough job, and police ought to be required to do it in a way that represents us well, because every time they do something, they lay a hand on somebody, they're doing so with the authority of us, the community, as our representatives, to sort of restrain, control, use force upon people. And so I think they ought to be held to a really high standard. I think they should be paid really well for that unique role that they play. But I also think they ought to be held to a high standard of responsibility and values. And in the article, I talk about the fact of the blue wall of silence, which I think is exactly the opposite of what I'm calling for. This idea that police don't tell on other police, even when they violate laws or policies of the police department, even when they lie, cheat, and steal, using their authority as police officers to accomplish those goals. Police almost universally do not tell on other police officers, and that blue wall of silence is highly problematic and reflects, I think, a sense of the elevated importance of individual police officers. And that's the problem ultimately with Blue Lives Matter, is that it is not a we're all equals, right? That would be sort of all lives matter if it was really meant by people who say all lives matter. What they're saying instead is Blue Lives Matter more.
Yeah, and it also leads us into that bad apple critique of, it's not all police was something else that came out of the, but I mean, you tied the bad apples, and I think very cognizantly, to kind of the bad intent of white fragility, where D'Angelo kind of paints it so that if you're a racist, it's because you are a bad person. You have a moral failing. And it's only certain white people who have that moral failing. You don't know what's in my heart, right? That's what we hear.
Right.
And when we look at the police and the Blue Lives Matter, they say, well, it's just a few bad apples, a few bad actors. Most of us are doing the right thing. But how is that? That's a deflection, right? In both cases, white fragility and cop fragility, it deflects from a larger issue, correct?
Yeah. So let's think about the bad apple idea. So the resistance to the Black Lives Matter critique and general critiques of police is, yes, we admit there have been a few, bad acts, right? Whether it be John Burge in Chicago with thousands of acts of torture and violence and planting evidence, or the Ramparts scandal. I think it's Rampart in Los Angeles, but you can find these in most major cities. Huge patterns of violence and misdeeds and violations of law by police officers. And the response is usually, well, that was just a few bad apples. Unfortunately, the pattern, particularly with respect to excessive force, is a clear disproportionate use of excessive force against racial minorities, particularly Black and brown folks. And so the bad apples response ignores the pattern, that the pattern is much larger than a few high profile cases. And the blue wall of silence sort of illustrates that if it really were, there's just a couple of bad apples, we'd probably never hear about them, frankly, because of the blue wall of silence. But also there wouldn't be the need for a blue wall of silence, because if it really were just one or two officers in a department of thousands or hundreds who were, using the badge to, pick up prostitutes or steal drugs from drug dealers, you wouldn't need a department-wide sort of unofficial policy of never telling on anybody, because they could sever those two or three bad apples and let them be prosecuted. But instead, there's a suggestion, which we have a hard time getting evidence on, that there's a fairly widespread and varied set of misdeeds by police officers using their authority. And that's why there's a blue wall of silence. That's why the bad apples response doesn't really answer the question. That's why we need to pay attention to these patterns of disproportionate use of force. Not to mention, and I think it is really important, the most claimed police abuse is just simple, usually low-level use of force. But the second most claimed sort of filing of complaints is about sexual assaults of various sorts by police officers. And a variety of people, such as Andrea Ritchie, have pointed out that there is a strong pattern of, some police officers using their authority to sexually assault, usually women or trans women, and the problem is usually swept under the rug.
Yeah, and that level of corruption is really hard to, as you said, document and get moving in the court system, not even within the department. So I kind of want to end the discussion before we get to what can be done with, it seems like the two sides are fundamentally trying to say the same thing, which is we're being attacked. And Black Lives Matter is saying, stop killing us. And the police are saying, stop assaulting us. So how do we bring these two sides together? And how do we actually, if we wanted to see police reform, if we wanted to act within that space, what's the best way to start? And how do you combat like depolicing that you might not, as a community, the middle class isn't aware is happening, but is
Right.
being done in our name. So
Right.
where do we go from here, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, no, I think that is the question. And if it were an easy question, many other scholars would have answered it already. It's a tough question, I think, for civilians like us, for police departments that want to reform. For Black Lives Matter as a social movement that tries to be activist about bringing about change, it's really tough to know what are the solutions. So I'll start perhaps with the most radical solutions. The Black Lives Matter solutions are often things like reallocating some of the duties of police to other places. The best example of that is dealing with houseless people, dealing with those who are having mental issues on the street, dealing with people who have drug addiction. These are things that social workers specialize in helping people with in a permanent way. And the problem for police officers is when they come across somebody talking to themselves and maybe being rowdy on a public street, they really don't have a lot of tools, right? Their tool is the handcuff, the billy club, the taser, the gun. And that's why we get, unfortunately, a lot of incidents, too many incidents of police violence against particularly the mentally ill who are unarmed or who are armed or who didn't present a significant threat of harm to the public. And that's sad, but that's one way of dealing with it, is to reallocate some of these things. And I've talked to police officers here at Las Vegas Metro, which is the largest police department in the state of Nevada and covers Las Vegas and some surrounding areas. Some police officers in Las Vegas Metro say things that I've heard other police officers across the country say. We don't want this job, right? We don't want to be dealing with houseless people who, have a bunch of clothes and other materials out on the sidewalk, sort of interfering with, people's sort of quiet enjoyment of the street. That's not something we do well. Mental health issues, right? Not really well trained to deal with that. There's increasing training, right, that's sort of tacked on about how might you deal differently with a mental health issue? And there have been some experiments with sending a social worker or a mental health expert out with the police in the right circumstances, right? So we're not talking about there's a guy with an assault rifle and he's also talking to himself, let's send social workers, right? For that, we send a SWAT team, and we should send a SWAT team. But, there's a guy kind of wandering down the street and he's half dressed and he's sort of waving around even a knife but certainly just sort of, looking menacingly at people. That seems like a good circumstance for sending either mental health experts only or mental health experts with police backup. That seems to me, that's one of the solutions, is a way of reallocating resources to people who can specialize in helping. And that's a lot of problems, right? That's a lot of cases of police killings, involves the houseless, those having mental breakdowns, and similar sorts of issues. So that would really help to address the problem. Black Lives Matter, again, heterogeneous movement, but generally also talks about taking policing to the local level, particularly in poor racial minority communities, like self-patrolling and community-oriented solutions like restorative justice, so that if there's somebody in an act of domestic violence, trying to have an expert in restorative justice in sort of mediation, negotiation, and bring together the parties if they want to come together to talk about what was the harm here. Can the perpetrator acknowledge the harm? If there's been harm, which usually there would have been, what can sort of work as some restitution for the person who's been harmed. And oftentimes in restorative justice, they're not talking about give the person money or banish the person from the city. They're talking about you hit me in front of my children. What I want you to do is to go get, some rehabilitation about your anger management. But I also want you to go and do some work with kids in the community and help teach boys and girls, right? Because it's often depicted as a heterosexual male-female problem, but often it's a male-male, female-female problem as well. But go teach children, right, to resist using violence as a response to disagreement. That kind of thing is more what it aims towards. And the idea is to restore the community, not just take somebody out of the community or punish somebody in a sort of retributivist or even utilitarian way. So that's a part of it. The broader solution is that Black Lives Matter touts is sort of a shift in what they call racial capitalism. That is the way that a lot of these neighborhoods have no businesses, right? Or, well, they do have businesses, liquor stores, gambling joints, and that's about it, right? And that some of the shift that's needed is to bring economic development to these communities so that people have hope. And then obviously a focus on education. So there's like a really broad program that they have, some pieces of which are more concretely something that could easily be done to shift resources from policing to other aspects of building communities. So that's one. I think in terms of police reforms and the proposals that have been made, I am on record as saying that I think implicit bias training is helpful. Is it the solution? I don't think so, but it probably does more harm, does more good than harm. And a lot of times, even from an abolitionist, Black Lives Matter perspective, the question is this reformist reform or is this non-reformist reform? And reformist reform is seen as reform, some changes that just sort of tinker around the edges and don't really solve the underlying problem, right? So if what we say is that the police are first going to ticket, a houseless person who's like taking up part of a sidewalk or something like that, that certainly reduces harm in one way, but it might not solve the underlying problem. That if you can ticket and then the second time you can throw somebody in jail, then it's not doing a lot to change the way things are done now. And a lot of times the houseless, those with having mental episodes, they can't fix those things, right? They need something, addiction, counseling, et cetera, to really solve the underlying problem. And so those might be more reformist reforms. Non-reformist reforms try and get at things like providing more housing options, right? And particularly housing options maybe that aren't traditional housing, because not all people who are houseless want a traditional home. So a variety of things like that. To think broadly, implicit bias training is helpful. Reducing the incidence of ticketing and putting people in jail for houselessness, mental episodes, addiction would be helpful, but getting at the underlying problems would be more helpful. So I've seen implicit bias training proposed de-escalation training, which I do think is helpful because when you train police, like, don't first go for your gun, can you use your words, right? As we tell all children, can you use lower levels of violence and think about where you are on the necessity for force? I do think that's helpful, and that's been done in Las Vegas with some positive effects. So those are sort of more traditional police reforms, like the de-escalation training, that I think is helpful, if not the ultimate solution, because a lot of the ultimate solution is education. That could be education of police officers, like the implicit bias, or hiring police officers that have college degrees, so they're more likely to have been exposed to a broader array of people and a broader array of ideas, and maybe be less violent. And then so that's sort of the police reforms aspect of it. Community involvement, I think civilians have to sort of stand up and say, not in our name, right? And that, to me, will be the most important driver of any meaningful change, whatever we want that change to look like. More policy, standard sort of police practices reforms, or radical reforms like self-policing in certain communities, and more education, more economic development, things like that are going to require civilians to stand up and say, not in our name, we will vote for real change.
And I think one of the things, as you were kind of explaining all that, came to my mind is that we have this real victim mentality that keeps a lot of civilians either in the dark about what's going on or afraid of what could go on. And I see Blue Lives Matter, the way you describe it too, is also kind of, it's reframing that victim mentality from taking it away from the community and putting it on cops and saying, we're the real victims here. We're the ones who are under attack. We're not getting the support from you, the community. And those are really powerful and effective narratives. So, we need to, I think you point out in the article, kind of this conversational mode of solving these problems, and a good faith sitting down and talking about it. So if maybe we could end with kind of how that might look in a community in regard to, not so much reforming, but kind of challenging these narratives that really are so, persuasive at keeping the status quo, even in the face of some reforms.
Yeah, I think that's very well framed, that we are told you are in danger. There's chaos out there. We're the thin blue line keeping you from being a victim of crime. And that narrative drives an elevation of the police, giving them whatever tools they want, regardless of whether that's really how we want them to represent us. And so that's a problem. And then in the article, I talk at the end about like having difficult conversations, and that we're going to have some difficult conversations about who do we value in our communities? Do we value people who seem to have fallen by the wayside? And do we value people who may be doing something wrong, right? Whether it's law breaking or short of law breaking, do we still value their rights and how they get treated, how they get responded to by the police? And I hope that we do. And then have the police come in and talk about what their needs are for safety, and try and convince them that they don't need to be overly aggressive in many of the situations in which they are, that there may be better ways to achieve safety, but also uphold our values.
Yeah, and I think you really nailed it with the difficult conversations.
Yeah.
These are not one and done seminars or whatever it is. This is
Right.
an ongoing process, and thank you for participating in that process and facilitating some of these discussions with your work, because this article and your other work really does engage this space in a way that is trying to do that, is having those different.
Well, thank you so much, John. And I really appreciate the library doing this type of thing. I think it's, you're helping build an informed community that can make decisions about what it wants done about policing and all kinds of other matters.